They told you Jesus was just a man from Nazareth, that he walked alone, a solitary figure in dusty sandals, preaching to the lost sheep of Israel, that the disciples were a motley crew of white-faced fishermen and tax collectors. That's cute, that's cute, because the truth hits different. The truth is darker, richer, and it's been erased from the textbooks, the churches, and even your Sunday school lessons. Ask yourself, why would they erase the very people who literally built the foundation? The people who stood beside him when the crowds were loud and the Romans were louder. The people who bore the weight of his mission and, yes, carried his cross? You ever notice how they never mention that? How the Gospels dance around their names, their faces, their very existence? It's not an accident. It's history being rewritten. Before Jesus could shake the world, before he could turn water into wine or feed thousands with a few scraps, he had brothers, not by blood, not by skin they wanted you to see, but by spirit, by shared vision, by courage, and most of them, they were black men, from Africa, from the Nile, from lands older than Rome, older than the Bible in the form you've been fed. These were men who knew oppression, who knew exile, who knew what it meant to survive in a world built to erase them. And yet, they chose to walk with him. They chose to follow the truth, even when that truth could kill them. Look at the Gospels, the names we think we know: Simon, called Peter, James, John, Andrew. But scratch the surface, look deeper. Outside the sanitized pages, in the apocryphal texts, in the early Christian writings that Rome tried to burn, you start seeing patterns. You start seeing African lineages. You see features described in ways that don't match the European Jesus staring at you from church murals. And this isn't cosmetic. This is intentional. When they made God white, when they painted the Savior of the world with pale skin, they erased the witnesses. They erased the brothers who carried him, literally, in every sense of the word. And here's the kicker: they weren't minor characters. Some of these men, the hidden disciples, were pillars of the early church. They traveled with him, protected him, even shielded him from Roman soldiers. When the crown of thorns pressed down on his head, who was there to lift him? Who ran beside him when the cross pressed into his shoulders? The Bible leaves that blank for a reason, because if you knew the truth, that some of the strongest, bravest, most faithful men at his side were black, it would disrupt centuries of control. It would challenge the very image of the Savior that Europe built to justify slavery, colonialism, and the systematic erasure of Africa. Imagine being betrayed like that. Imagine standing with the Son of God and knowing history would never give you credit. And now imagine being one of his descendants today, looking at a world that still forgets your people's role. The pride, the heartbreak, the fire, it all coexists. That's why we're here. That's why we dig. That's why we shine a light in the corners they hoped would stay dark forever. Ask yourself, how do you feel when you realize that the men who walked the same dusty roads, who shared meals, sweat and blood with Jesus, who helped him carry the weight of the world, are erased from the story you've been told to believe? And more importantly, why would they erase them? Because once you see the truth, once you recognize their faces, their lineage, their courage, you start to understand the betrayal isn't just ancient, it's still happening. It's in the church murals, the Sunday school lessons, the films that rewrite the gospel into a European fantasy, and it's in your mind, until someone shows you the receipts, until someone makes you feel it, until someone tells you the story your ancestors carried in their blood. So let me ask you, if the men who helped Jesus, who bore him and his message, were black, and the world denied them, what else have they been hiding? You ever wonder why the Gospels tell so little about some of the people closest to Jesus? Why the spotlight always lands on the ones they could sell? Peter, John, James, but never the men whose shoulders literally carried his burden. That's because the truth doesn't fit the story they wanted you to believe. The truth is inconvenient. The truth is powerful. The truth is African. Take Simon of Cyrene. You know him, right? The man forced to carry Jesus' cross. One verse in the Bible, and then poof, he disappears. That's all they give you. But dig deeper. and history whispers, Cyrene? That's not some tiny backwater. That's modern-day Libya. That's North Africa. That's a man from a land that had pharaohs, scholars, traders, and warriors for thousands of years before Rome ever flexed its muscles. Simon wasn't just a bystander. He was a strong man, a man of lineage, probably trained in endurance, in survival. And when the Roman soldiers said, "Carry it," he didn't flinch. He took the weight of the cross, the literal embodiment of the world's sin, on his shoulders. And for centuries, they erased his story. And Simon wasn't alone. There's Joseph of Arimathea, a man whose wealth and influence put him close to the crucifixion. Some scholars argue he had African roots, a trader, a man in touch with the broader Mediterranean world where Africa wasn't foreign, it was central. These men traveled, they carried wisdom, goods, and yes, they carried Jesus. They were connectors, bridges between continents, cultures, and people. And yet, their faces vanish from stained glass. Their hands are never held up in statues. Why? Because Africa was too powerful, too essential, too real. And Europe had a narrative to control. Let's talk about the 12. We know the names: Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas. But here's the thing, they weren't all white. They weren't all Galilean peasants as the textbooks like to claim. There's strong evidence that several of them had African heritage. Some texts hint at Cushite lineage, the descendants of the great civilizations along the Nile, Ethiopia, Sudan, Nubia. These were men whose families had kingdoms, armies, knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and philosophy long before Greece borrowed it. Ask yourself, if Europe wanted to paint a picture of divine whiteness, why would they include men who carried African strength, African wisdom, African blood into the story? Even the Gospels of Thomas and the Gospel of the Hebrews, texts the Vatican tried to suppress, hint at these men's influence. They aren't just witnesses, they're teachers, leaders, visionaries. They ask questions Jesus answers, they debate theology, they carry his mission after the crucifixion. And that's why they had to vanish. Because if you saw them, if you knew their lineage, you'd question every painting, every Sunday sermon, every movie that claimed history was universal, but actually served European agendas. Now here's the part that hits deep. The erasure isn't just about skin color, it's about power. Control the image, control the mind. Make God look like the people in power. Make the Savior look like the rulers. And make sure the heroes who actually did the heavy lifting, literally and metaphorically, are hidden. That's psychology. That's manipulation. That's a centuries-long hustle to make the world forget whose hands carried the most important story ever told. Think about it. These men, Simon, Joseph, possibly others lost to history, they weren't there to look pretty. They weren't extras. They were the backbone, the silent strength, the guardians of the mission. And when you see the paintings of Jesus on the cross, hanging there alone in white robes with pale skin, ask yourself, who actually carried him? Whose arms held him up when the nails went in? Who bore the weight of the world so that European rulers could rewrite history for profit and power? That's why we have to dig. That's why we have to follow the hidden sources, the whispers in the Apocrypha, the marginal notes, the oral histories from Africa and the diaspora. Because once you trace their lineage, once you see their faces in the ancient art and descriptions, you start to realize the foundation was black, the scaffolding was black, and yet, for centuries, the world pretended it wasn't. Ask yourself, if the disciples were African, if the men who literally carried Jesus' mission and his cross were black, then what else have they been hiding? What else in the story of faith, of civilization, of the world, is built on African hands and erased from memory? And that's when you start seeing the betrayal in full color. You ever notice how history feels incomplete? Like someone handed you half a puzzle and said, "Good luck?" That's exactly what they did. Because the pieces that matter, the faces, the names, the stories of the men who walked with Jesus, they didn't make the cut. They were erased, burned, silenced. And the craziest part, they were erased for profit, for power, for control. Look at the early texts, the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of Thomas. These aren't conspiracy theories whispered in some corner of the internet. These are real, ancient writings, and in them, descriptions of disciples who don't look like the European Jesus staring at you in church, Cushite features, African names, people from the Nile, from Nubia, from Ethiopia, who debated, questioned, and carried the weight of the gospel alongside him. These weren't extras. They weren't background characters. They were leaders. In the church, they called these texts heresy and tried to burn them all. Imagine a world where the history of your people is literally fireproofed out of existence, and it wasn't just manuscripts, artwork, sculptures, mosaics from the early Christian world show figures with darker skin, curly hair, full lips, exactly the features that later vanished when European artists started painting saints and apostles. You've seen the stained glass windows, right? All pale faces, all soft features, but go to the catacombs of Rome. Look at the earliest frescoes. You see what they tried to erase. They whitewashed the story, literally. They repainted history so that the people who were actually there would disappear from your memory. Think about the psychology for a second. Control the image, control the mind. You see a white Jesus, white apostles, a white holy family, and what happens? You start believing that greatness, holiness, divine favor, all of that belongs to the same people who erased the black men who were there first. It's genius, it's cruel, and it works. Because now, centuries later, even when evidence exists, even when you read the texts, your brain is fighting the story you were fed. Cognitive dissonance, they call it. You're literally trained to doubt the truth. And then there's the oral histories, passed down in Ethiopia, Nubia, and even in the diaspora after slavery. They speak of black apostles, men who carried teachings, traveled to spread them, and protected the legacy of Jesus' message. These weren't small missions. These were the backbone of early Christianity before Rome monopolized it. Ask yourself, if these men were nothing, why do entire communities still tell their names, still honor them, still remember them when the world forgot? Let's be real. What's erased isn't just history, it's identity, it's power. Because when they hide your ancestors, they steal your ability to see yourself as capable, as holy, as part of a legacy bigger than centuries of oppression. That's why Simon of Cyrene doesn't get a statue. That's why Joseph of Arimathea is reduced to a footnote. That's why you never heard the stories of the Cushite, Ethiopian, Nubian, and African disciples who protected him, carried him, and made sure the gospel survived. But here's the kicker. The missing pieces aren't lost forever. They're hidden. You just have to know where to look. Archaeological finds, forgotten manuscripts, early Christian art that wasn't approved by Rome, oral tradition that refuses to die. Each piece you uncover starts to form a picture of strength, a picture of black men at the center of the story, literally holding up the weight of salvation. And every time you find a piece, every time you see it, it's like history winking at you, saying, you see now, you finally see. And that's when the betrayal hits hardest. Not just because they lied, not just because they painted over your ancestors, but because they convinced the world that what they erased didn't matter, that the people who were closest to the Son of God could be vanished, forgotten, and the story would still feel complete. That's audacity. That's theft. That's why this history isn't just interesting, it's revolutionary. So let me ask you, if the black men who carried Jesus, who protected him, who preserved his teachings, have been systematically erased, then what else in the world has been rewritten to hide African influence? And who benefits when the truth stays buried? They call it the cradle of civilization. Funny, right? Because most textbooks act like it started somewhere else. Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia. Cute. That's the lie. Africa was first. Africa was everything. Before the Greeks were building columns, before Rome was flexing armies, before Europe even had a clue about philosophy, Africa was running kingdoms, mapping the stars, inventing math, medicine, and writing systems that would make you dizzy. We're talking Egypt, Nubia, Kush, Axum, empires older than time books want to admit, cities with libraries so vast they put Europe's first universities to shame, schools teaching geometry, astronomy, and ethics to children of all colors, not just a privileged few. Ask yourself, if Africa was so advanced, why would Europe spend centuries rewriting history, erasing these empires, and painting their rulers pale? Power, profit, control. They couldn't let the world know that the people who built pyramids, irrigation systems, and early medicine were black. That knowledge would undermine the story that Europe was the center of everything. Let's talk specifics. Nubia, south of Egypt, wasn't just a neighbor, it ruled Egypt at one point. Entire dynasties of black pharaohs sat on thrones, wore crowns, and commanded armies. The so-called black pharaohs didn't just build monuments, they built societies. They wrote laws, they traded gold, ivory and grain across Africa and beyond. And yet, when you open your history book, they are footnotes, erased, replaced with whitewashed kings and queens who never existed. That's deliberate. That's theft. That's the betrayal. And it wasn't only rulers. Africa produced knowledge that changed the world. Mathematics, the geometry that built the pyramids, the precision of the Nile's flooding cycles, the stars mapped for navigation, all African in origin. Medicine, African healers documented surgical techniques, herbal remedies, and even early antiseptics long before Europe discovered them. Navigation, Africans crossed oceans. They traded with India, Arabia, and possibly even the Americas centuries before Columbus. The knowledge of Africa flowed like a river, and Europe wanted to dam it, redirect it, and take credit. Here's the connection to our story. The men who walked with Jesus didn't come from nowhere. They weren't peasants in some backwater village. They came from a world of intellect, resilience, and power. Simon of Cyrene, Joseph of Arimathea, they carried not just a physical burden, they carried the wisdom, strategy, and lineage of Africa. That's why they were strong. That's why they survived. That's why the Romans and later historians tried to erase them, because their roots were undeniable. Ask yourself, how different would history look if the world knew that the men closest to Jesus were not just black, but products of some of the most advanced civilizations the world had ever seen? If Africa's influence was front and center, not hidden in footnotes, every European story of discovery would crumble. Every whitewashed painting, every Sunday school lesson, every film about biblical history would have to be reimagined. And that's why they buried the truth. Africa wasn't just first. Africa was the teacher. Africa produced the blueprint. And when African men walked with Jesus, they weren't outsiders. They were the continuation of that legacy. The wisdom of the Nile, the courage of the Kushite warriors, the discipline of Axumite scholars. It all flowed through their veins. And yet, for centuries, the world looked at them and pretended they were nothing, pretended they were invisible. Think about that. The foundation of human civilization, the early science, the philosophy, the leadership, all black, and the very people who carried that knowledge into one of history's most important stories were erased. That's more than betrayal. That's assault. And when you realize that, when the pride hits and the anger rises, you start asking bigger questions. What else did they hide? How much of what you think you know is a carefully curated illusion? Because once you see Africa first, and not some secondary player in European fairy tales, everything shifts. You see the disciples differently. You see the Bible differently. You see the world differently. And the first question isn't why did they lie? It's who benefits from the lie. And that's where the story turns darker, because the erasure of Africa isn't just about the past. It's about control, power, and profit that echoes all the way to today. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack next. You ever notice how history always has a hero? And it's never the people who did the work? That's not coincidence. That's design. The story of Jesus, the disciples, and the rise of Christianity didn't get rewritten by accident. It was deliberate, systematic, and it was profitable. Rome didn't just want to control land. They wanted to control minds. And what better way than to control the narrative of the most powerful story the world had ever seen? Jesus was revolutionary, radical, threatening to the establishment, and the men who carried him, the black men, the African men, were too strong a presence, too undeniable, too connected to the cradle of civilization, to fit the sanitized version Europe wanted to sell. So they got cut, silenced, buried. Fast forward a few centuries, and the game is clearer. When Constantine legalized Christianity, he didn't just pick a religion, he picked a brand. He picked a story that could unify an empire under his control. And in that brand, the men who carried Jesus, the African disciples, were inconvenient, because if the truth got out that the backbone of Christianity was black, suddenly the empire's image of divine authority didn't look so European anymore. Suddenly, the rulers couldn't claim heaven was on their side. And that's why the rewriting happened. The apocryphal texts, the oral histories, the art, all destroyed, hidden, or repainted. Saints and apostles were whitened. Stories of black disciples were erased or merged into others. Simon of Cyrene became a footnote. Joseph of Arimathea became a Europeanized shadow. The original story, gone, replaced by a version that served power. That version, that's what they sold to the world. And they got rich, doing it, literally. Wealth, control, legitimacy. The narrative became currency. Ask yourself, how easy is it to sell a world a version of history where the heroes don't look like the people who actually made the story possible? Very easy, if you control the image. And Europe did. Paint it, sculpt it, print it, teach it in schools, make the people carrying the weight invisible. And every time someone believed it, the power gap widened. Every time someone doubted themselves, because they didn't see their ancestors in the story, control tightened. This wasn't just European arrogance. It was strategy, dark psychology, applied across centuries. If you control the story, you control the culture. If you control the culture, you control perception. And if you control perception, you control destiny. That's why they erased African disciples. That's why they whitewashed Jesus. That's why African empires were footnotes. And it worked. For centuries, people forgot. Or worse, they believed the lie. But here's the twist. They didn't erase everything. You can still see the fingerprints. You just have to know where to look. Ancient texts, hidden traditions, murals, and oral histories. They left breadcrumbs, and when you follow them, the story shifts. You start to see the disciples, not as passive followers, but as active agents, as Africans carrying wisdom, courage, and power. You see Africa as central, not peripheral. And suddenly, the betrayal isn't subtle, it's in your face. Imagine what it feels like to realize that the world you believed was universal was actually curated, that every painting, every Sunday school lesson, every film was a carefully constructed illusion, that the men who carried the cross, who preserved the teachings, who protected the mission, were erased for profit and power. It's infuriating. It's heartbreaking. But here's the thing. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. That knowledge becomes fuel. That awareness becomes agency. That truth becomes fire. So ask yourself, if the rewriting of the disciples' story was profitable, deliberate, and systematic, then what other parts of history have they tampered with? And how many times have we been trained to revere the wrong faces, while forgetting the ones who actually did the work? Because when you start asking that question, when you start connecting the erasure of the disciples to the erasure of entire African civilizations, you realize this isn't just history, this is power. And once you see who really held it, everything changes. You ever notice how the people in power don't just conquer lands, they conquer minds? That's exactly what happened with the story of Jesus and his disciples. Erasing African men from his inner circle wasn't just about whitewashing history. It was about controlling belief, controlling perception, controlling reality itself. Think about it. When every painting, every statue, every stained glass window depicts a pale Jesus surrounded by pale apostles, what happens in the subconscious? You start believing divinity looks a certain way, holiness belongs to certain features, power and moral authority are coded into skin tone. And that's no accident, that's calculated. That's centuries of psychological manipulation, baked into the very images meant to inspire faith. Simon of Cyrene, Joseph of Arimathea, possibly other disciples, all erased or muted. The people who bore the mission literally carried the weight of the cross, vanished from the cultural memory, and in their place, a version of history, so sanitized, so European, it rewires minds across generations. Children grow up believing the heroes, the backbone of faith, couldn't possibly look like them if they're black. That's internalized doubt, that's identity theft, that's control. Ask yourself, how do you respect a story, a faith, or a culture when the people who built it are systematically erased, when the proof of their existence is hidden behind centuries of lies and propaganda? That doubt seeps into your psyche. It whispers, maybe you don't belong, maybe greatness isn't for you. And for hundreds of years, that whisper became a roar that kept the descendants of Africa questioning their value, their place, their potential. Europeans understood this. Control the image, control the mind, make the world see what you want, believe what you want, remember what you want, and they did it with precision. Art, literature, sermons, movies, all tools in a massive campaign of selective memory. Even early church councils weren't just about doctrine, they were about who could be remembered, who could be erased, who would define the narrative. African disciples, gone. African influence, reassigned. African greatness, buried. But psychological warfare works best when it's subtle. They didn't just erase faces, they erased lineage, erased knowledge, erased evidence of African civilizations as central to human history. They made Europe look like the origin of innovation and morality, while Africa became the dark continent, a blank slate for exploitation. And the real victims, the descendants who grew up thinking their ancestors were secondary, peripheral, unimportant. That's why you have to understand this isn't ancient history. It's living. It's psychological chains we still carry today. Yet here's the beautiful part. The mind is also a place of reclamation. Once you start seeing the truth, Simon of Cyrene's African strength, the disciples' hidden lineage, Africa's foundational role, the chains start to break. Every time you point out the erasure, every time you uncover a manuscript, a mural, an oral history, you pull back a layer of control. You start rewriting the story in your mind. And that's power, that's resistance, that's awakening. Let's not forget, the stakes were high. These weren't minor manipulations. European rulers knew that acknowledging African disciples could threaten the very legitimacy of their empires. That's why they invested so much in controlling the image. Every whitewashed statue, every sanitized Bible illustration, every Europeanized sermon was a brick in a wall meant to keep African strength, African leadership, and African divinity out of sight, out of mind, out of history. Ask yourself this. If controlling images can control centuries of belief, then what else have they been controlling? What else have they hidden behind pictures, paint, and propaganda? And more importantly, what happens when you refuse to see their version anymore? Because once you see, truly see, the manipulation, the betrayal, and the brilliance of those erased, something shifts. Pride replaces doubt, anger sharpens insight, and what was once invisible now stands in full, undeniable presence. Simon of Cyrene isn't just a footnote anymore. Joseph of Arimathea isn't a shadow. They are real. They are black. They are ours, and history has to acknowledge it. Here's the thing they never tell you. Europe wasn't just afraid of Africa's armies. They weren't scared of pyramids or gold alone. What terrified them, what kept them awake at night, was African knowledge, the kind of knowledge that could liberate minds, shift power, and expose the lies Europe built their empire on. Think about it. The men who walked with Jesus didn't just carry his body. They carried wisdom, African wisdom, from the Nile, from Kush, from Nubia, from Ethiopia, places where astronomy, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and governance had been mastered centuries before Rome could write a coherent sentence. These men were living vessels of that knowledge. They weren't naive followers. They were strategists, teachers, and protectors, and that terrified Europe. Simon of Cyrene, Joseph of Arimathea, and other African disciples weren't just muscle. They were mind. They understood strategy, survival, the cycles of nature, and the ways of humans, lessons passed down from empires older than anyone reading the Bible would ever admit. They knew how to carry messages without being caught. They knew how to preserve wisdom when the world tried to burn it. They were living proof that the backbone of civilization didn't belong to Europe, and that scared them. Europe's fear wasn't subtle. It bled into their propaganda, their whitewashed art, their sanitized stories. They painted Jesus pale. They minimized the African presence. They erased African disciples, because knowledge is power, and power in the wrong hands, African hands, threatened centuries of control. Imagine an army of minds, trained by empires older than Rome, walking alongside the savior of the world. That was the nightmare. That's why the erasure had to be absolute. Ask yourself, if Europe spent centuries controlling the story, whitewashing the apostles, and erasing African influence, then what did they fear the most? The answer is simple: truth. Truth undermines power. Truth exposes theft. Truth awakens generations who have been trained to doubt themselves. And that is exactly what Simon, Joseph, and the African disciples carried with them, a blueprint of truth that could topple empires if remembered. Even the early church recognized it. Councils, doctrines, and edicts weren't just theological, they were political. Anything that hinted at African leadership, anything that showed Africans preserving and spreading Jesus' teachings, was suppressed. Manuscripts were burned, stories were rewritten, art was repainted, and yet traces remained: whispers in apocryphal texts, murals in hidden catacombs, oral histories passed across the Nile, and eventually to the diaspora. Europe feared them enough to erase them, but the truth is stubborn. Now, here's the emotional twist. Imagine being the descendants of those men today. Imagine realizing that your ancestors weren't passive, weren't hidden, weren't servants. They were kings, warriors, scholars, and strategists, walking alongside the most important figure in history, and the world tried to make you forget it. That's more than betrayal. That's psychological warfare across centuries. And yet, here you are, finding the breadcrumbs, piecing the puzzle together, reclaiming what was stolen. Ask yourself, what happens when the fear that drove Europe's erasure meets the pride of a people who refuse to forget? When the stolen narratives are recovered, the ancestors honored, and the truth finally told, that fear isn't gone, it's just waiting to be confronted. In that confrontation, it begins with knowing who really carried the story, who preserved it, and who survived to hand it down. Because once you see the power of African knowledge, the reason they were terrified, the reason they erased it, it changes everything. The disciples aren't just historical footnotes. Africa isn't just the cradle of civilization, and you aren't just a bystander. You are the inheritor of stolen knowledge, stolen pride, and stolen power. And the world isn't ready for you to fully remember. They call it ancient wisdom, but let's be real. It was advanced knowledge. Africa didn't just give the world stories and gold. Africa gave the world systems, structures, ideas that still run the modern world. And the men who walked with Jesus carried that in their bones. That's why they weren't just followers. They were teachers, strategists, preservers of knowledge that could change empires. Let's start with math. The Egyptians and Nubians weren't scribbling numbers for fun. They developed geometry, algebra, and early calculus long before Greece thought to ask. The pyramids weren't magic. They were applied mathematics, on a scale that still baffles engineers today. And the disciples, they were raised in a world where logic, measurement, and precision were sacred. That knowledge traveled with them. It shaped how they read, wrote, taught, and protected Jesus' message. Medicine. African healers documented surgical procedures, antiseptics, herbal remedies, and treatments for diseases centuries before Europe had a clue. The disciples carried more than scrolls. They carried practical wisdom, how to care for the sick, how to survive in hostile environments, how to interpret the natural world. This knowledge was survival. It was revolutionary, and Europe wanted none of it recognized, because if it was, their myth of white superiority would crumble. Astronomy. Africans mapped the stars, charted planetary cycles, predicted solar events, and navigated vast distances across deserts, rivers, and oceans. They knew the skies better than any European discoverer, and the men walking with Jesus were connected to that knowledge. They understood time, season, and navigation. They knew the world beyond Israel. Ask yourself, how powerful is it to have that kind of knowledge when your mission involves moving across lands, avoiding enemies, and preserving revolutionary teachings? Philosophy. Africa didn't wait for Plato to invent ethics. Nubian, Egyptian, and Ethiopian schools debated morality, leadership, the soul, and the cosmos long before the Western canon existed. These disciples weren't passive. They asked questions, they debated, they reasoned. They carried intellectual fire from the cradle of civilization into the heart of the emerging faith, and that intellectual fire terrified Europe. Because it wasn't easily controlled, it couldn't be silenced by repainting a window or rewriting a text. Trade, diplomacy, law, writing systems, all African in origin, and all contributing to the disciples' worldview. When you see Simon of Cyrene, Joseph of Arimathea, and the others, you're seeing men shaped by empires older than Rome, connected to knowledge networks that spanned continents. They weren't just followers, they were the backbone of a revolution. They were the ones making sure the message survived, uncorrupted, across hostile terrain. Now think about Europe. What happens when you walk into a story like Christianity and realize its strongest supporters were black men carrying centuries of wisdom? You get terrified. You try to erase them. You paint over them. You tell the world they didn't exist. You distort the narrative so thoroughly that the descendants of these men grow up believing they had no role in the foundation of faith, science, or civilization. That's psychological warfare at its finest, and that's why we have to reclaim it. Not just for pride, not just for identity, but because understanding this flips the entire story. It reframes faith. It reframes civilization. It reframes power. Once you see that Africa taught the world, and that the men who carried Jesus were part of that lineage, you realize the erasure wasn't just historical, it was existential. Ask yourself this. If African knowledge shaped the disciples, and the disciples shaped the survival of Christianity, then what other truths about civilization have been hidden? What other pillars of the world, the arts, the sciences, the moral framework, have black hands built, carried, and preserved, only for history to lie about them? Because the moment you start asking that question, you start peeling back centuries of deception, and once you peel back the veil, you can't unsee it. The truth hits harder than any textbook ever will. Before there were kings in Europe, there were black pharaohs running entire nations. Before there were scribes in Rome, there were African prophets recording history, law, and philosophy on papyrus. And here's the kicker. These weren't minor figures. These were the architects of civilization, the men who would shape empires, knowledge, and religion, and their bloodline, their teachings, their presence, flowed into the very story of Jesus and his disciples. Look at the Cushite pharaohs, black rulers of Egypt, whose dynasties stretched across centuries, men who commanded armies, built pyramids taller than anything Rome would attempt, and managed economies larger than most medieval kingdoms. Their images survive in statues and reliefs, skin dark, features unmistakably African. And when you compare them to the disciples, you see a continuity: strength, intellect, leadership, the same DNA, the same cultural foundation, the same resilience. Ask yourself, if these men were the blueprint, could the disciples really have been anything less than extraordinary? Then there are the prophets, Ethiopian scribes, Nubian sages, and other African seers, whose writings predate European historians by centuries. Some of these texts were absorbed into early biblical traditions, some were erased, some hidden. But when you read the surviving manuscripts, you realize the Old Testament, the stories of wisdom, the moral laws, were recorded by people whose lineage and worldview were deeply African. These prophets were not just chroniclers, they were advisors, strategists, teachers, the intellectual backbone of spiritual tradition, and that influence carried through into the disciples' own knowledge and teachings. Look at visual evidence. Ancient mosaics, frescoes, and temple reliefs show men of African features in positions of power, sanctity, and leadership, from pharaohs sitting on golden thrones to priests inscribing sacred texts. Their authority is unmistakable. When Europe repaints history to make these figures pale, it isn't just dishonesty, it's theft. It's trying to rewrite the DNA of civilization itself, and that includes the men who walked with Jesus. They carried that lineage in their posture, in their strength, in their intellect. Ask yourself, if the African pharaohs and prophets built the foundation of law, morality, and governance, then isn't it likely that the disciples who emerged from that lineage carried more than just faith? They carried a blueprint for civilization, a blueprint Europe tried to erase, but which pulses beneath every surviving trace of history. That's why Simon of Cyrene, Joseph of Arimathea, and others were so indispensable. They weren't just physically strong, they were intellectually, culturally, and spiritually formidable. Here's the painful part: centuries of whitewashing, of repainted images, of footnotes, and erasure have convinced generations that these men didn't exist. To the disciples were simple peasants, that African influence was minimal or secondary. But the visual and textual evidence is there. You just have to look beyond the sanitized surfaces. Compare the mosaics of Nubian priests to depictions of early apostles. Notice the similarities in posture, in expression, in presence, the same energy, the same lineage. Ask yourself, who really carried the story? And that's why reclaiming these images matters. Because when you restore the black pharaohs and prophets to their rightful place, you also restore the disciples. You see the continuum: African wisdom shaping early Christianity, African strength sustaining its survival, African identity woven into the very fibers of the faith. You see that the erasure wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate. But now, the evidence can't be ignored. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine the emotional weight of this truth. The ancestors of Africa not only built empires and preserved knowledge, but also literally carried the savior of the world. The betrayal of centuries becomes palpable. The pride of rediscovery becomes electric. And the question becomes, if the very foundation of faith and civilization has been hidden, then how much more of your heritage has been buried alongside it? Because when you start connecting the dots, black pharaohs, African prophets, the disciples themselves, you realize the story isn't European, it's African, it's ours. And every lie, every whitewashed painting, every footnote that minimized African influence begins to crumble under the weight of truth. They call it the Dark Ages. Dark for who? Because Africa was glowing. While Europe stumbled through famine, plague, and barbarism, the Moors were lighting cities, building libraries, and running universities that would make today's Ivy Leagues look like child's play. That's right, while Rome fell and Europe forgot how to read, the Moors preserved knowledge, science, medicine, and culture. And this isn't exaggeration, it's history they tried to bury. Spain, North Africa, Sicily, these weren't just colonies, they were beacons. Cordoba alone had over 400,000 books in its libraries, at the height of Moorish rule. Mathematics, astronomy, engineering, medicine, philosophy, the Moors had it all. They didn't just preserve Greek and Roman knowledge, they improved it, expanded it, made it better. They were scholars, inventors, architects, and visionaries. And here's the kicker, without them, Europe would have stayed in the Dark Ages much longer. Literally, civilization as we know it owes them a debt it never repaid. Ask yourself, who do you hear about when they teach medieval Europe? Charlemagne, knights, kings, popes. Who gets left out? The African Moors who rebuilt cities, translated texts, taught the sciences, and reintroduced Europe to logic, medicine, and mathematics. These men were the bridge. Without them, the foundation of the Renaissance doesn't exist. The European narrative is a lie because it hides who actually carried civilization through its darkest hour, and this connects back to the disciples. The African men who walked with Jesus weren't isolated. They were heirs to centuries of African scholarship, leadership, and spiritual depth. They knew the value of knowledge. They preserved wisdom even when empires tried to erase it. And centuries later, their descendants, the Moors, did the same. They saved Europe from ignorance, carried civilization on their shoulders, and got no credit. Just like Simon of Cyrene and Joseph of Arimathea. Here's the irony. Europe benefited from everything the Moors offered: mathematics for architecture, medicine for hospitals, astronomy for navigation, literature, philosophy, law, all preserved, all refined, all taught by Africans. And when they eventually regained power, Europe systematically erased them from the story, paint over their mosaics, remove their contributions from textbooks, call it the Renaissance, and pretend it started with white faces. That's theft. That's betrayal. That's what happens when you control the narrative. But here's the beauty of truth. It's stubborn. The receipts survive. The architecture of Granada, the libraries of Cordoba, the scientific treatises in Arabic. These aren't stories, they are physical proof. African civilization didn't just influence Europe, it literally held it up. And just like the disciples who carried Jesus, the Moors carried humanity through chaos. Without them, Europe's progress would have been delayed centuries. Now ask yourself, if the world owes so much to African Moors, to African disciples, to African knowledge that shaped law, medicine, mathematics, and faith, then why is the story still whitewashed? Why are classrooms, movies, and textbooks still lying? Because power is the ultimate motivator. They can take your heritage, rewrite your history, and convince the world it never existed. And we've been believing it for centuries. Here's the emotional truth. When you see the Moors, you see your ancestors saving the world and getting none of the glory. When you see Simon of Cyrene, Joseph of Arimathea, or the African disciples, you see your ancestors walking with divinity itself. And that realization, it's empowering, it's infuriating, it's pride-inducing, and it's just the beginning. Because the more you uncover, the more you start connecting centuries of erasure, from the disciples, to the Pharaohs, to the Moors, and it hits you. The story we've been told isn't just incomplete, it's a lie, designed to keep us from remembering who we are, who we come from, and how much power was stolen from us. You ever notice how every European painting of Jesus or the apostles looks the same? Pale skin, soft features, long noses, gentle eyes. Every stained glass window, every church fresco, every Sunday school illustration reinforces the same image. That's not art, that's propaganda. That's history edited with a paintbrush. And the people who actually carried the story, preserved the knowledge, and shaped civilization, they disappeared from the canvas. Whitewashing didn't start with Jesus. It started with the entire story of Africa, the Moors, and the disciples. Artists, scholars, and rulers collaborated over centuries to create a narrative that centered whiteness as the default for intelligence, power, and divinity. They repainted statues, redrew maps, and retold stories to remove the African presence. Why? Because controlling the image meant controlling perception, which meant controlling society. And the fewer people recognized their ancestors' influence, the easier it was to justify slavery, colonization, and exploitation. It wasn't subtle, it was systematic. Take European textbooks, for example. African civilizations reduced to footnotes, Moors called Arabs, black disciples erased, pharaohs pale-washed, libraries burned, manuscripts hidden or rewritten. And the average person, sitting in a classroom for 12 years, never sees it, never questions it. They're trained to see Europe as the center of progress, innovation, and morality. The erasure works because it's invisible. You don't even realize what's missing until you dig. Even in literature and film, the pattern repeats. Hollywood tells the story of the Renaissance, of early Christianity, of exploration, of invention, and African hands are invisible. They were never absent, they were erased. The narrative was curated to make whiteness appear as the origin of everything. The real danger in this: generations internalize it. Children grow up thinking their ancestors didn't matter, their history is less than, and their potential is secondary. That's psychological control, that's cultural theft, that's power reinforced over centuries. Ask yourself, if history is written by those in power, what else have they hidden? If the African disciples, the Moors, the Pharaohs were central to the story, then how many other truths about human achievement have been buried? The systematic whitewashing didn't just change art or textbooks, it rewired the collective consciousness of the world. It decided who would be celebrated, who would be remembered, and who would be forgotten. And here's the betrayal. Even today, the damage lingers. People still believe the lies. Black children still grow up seeing pale faces as heroic, divine, or intellectual, while their own ancestors' contributions are invisible. The psychological scars of centuries of whitewashing aren't erased by a single history lesson. They persist because erasure is generational. It seeps into culture, media, and the subconscious. But here's the power of knowing the truth. Once you see the pattern, the burned libraries, the repainted saints, the footnotes where your ancestors should be, you start to reclaim it. You begin to notice what's missing. You start to ask questions. You begin to read beyond the sanitized story. You start to see the disciples, the pharaohs, the Moors, the African civilizations, not as relics of a lost past, but as the foundation of everything you take for granted today. Imagine walking into a museum or church and seeing the whitewashed version of history. Now imagine peeling back the layers, seeing the original murals, seeing the African faces, the pharaoh's features, the disciples' lineage. The betrayal hits you, the audacity hits you, and then pride rises, because suddenly, centuries of lies are confronted. Suddenly, the truth asserts itself, louder than any whitewashed narrative. Ask yourself, if they went to these lengths to hide the truth, then what must the truth contain? How powerful must the influence of African civilizations, the disciples, and the Moors have been for Europe to fear it so much? That question is the key, and the answer is exactly what we're uncovering. A truth too big, too bold, and too black to ignore. They tell you Columbus discovered America. That's cute. He didn't discover anything. People were already here, and the ones who connected continents before him, Africans. That's right, sailors, navigators, and explorers from West and North Africa crossed the Atlantic long before any European ship touched the New World. Ask yourself, if Africa built civilizations that mapped the stars and mastered navigation, why wouldn't they have crossed oceans? The evidence is everywhere, if you know where to look. Ancient African artifacts have been found in the Americas, including sculptures, tools, and even inscriptions that predate Columbus. Cultural practices, agricultural methods, and linguistic traces hint at transatlantic contact centuries before Europeans claimed the credit. And the irony, Europe not only stole the story of Africa's civilizations, but also the story of their explorations. They didn't just rewrite history at home, they exported that erasure across the Atlantic. Think about the implications. Africans crossed the ocean, traded goods, shared knowledge, and established connections in the Americas long before 1492. They brought seeds, crops, and agricultural techniques that shaped societies. They introduced navigation strategies, governance ideas, and even spiritual practices. These voyages weren't accidental. They were planned, sophisticated, and rooted in centuries of knowledge, passed down from empires like Mali, Songhai, and Ghana. And it connects back to the disciples. The men who carried Jesus' teachings were part of this broader continuum of African knowledge, courage, and exploration. They understood how to travel, how to survive in hostile lands, how to preserve wisdom across borders. That same tradition of ingenuity and adaptability is what allowed African navigators to reach the Americas long before Europeans even left port. Europeans had to cover this up. Why? Because if the world knew that Africans crossed the Atlantic first, that Africans influenced pre-Columbian America, it would completely dismantle the narrative of European discovery and superiority. The textbooks you grew up with, lies. The monuments, lies. The story that Columbus opened the New World was built on erasure, and every lie reinforced the idea that Africa was secondary, passive, and backward. Here's the psychological punch. For centuries, the descendants of these African navigators were enslaved in the very lands their ancestors had visited first. Their brilliance, their courage, their agency hidden, their contributions erased. And yet, the evidence survived in subtle ways. Oral histories, artifacts, agricultural practices, and cultural traditions. The traces of African presence were never fully destroyed. They were just waiting for someone to recognize them. Ask yourself, if Africans were shaping the Americas before Columbus, what else about pre-Columbian history has been hidden? How much of what we think of as indigenous or European introduced was actually influenced by Africans? The implications are massive. It rewrites the story of contact, trade, migration, and power. It shows that African intelligence, courage, and influence were global, not just local. And here's the emotional core. The same people who crossed oceans, built empires, and preserved civilization are the same people whose descendants carried Jesus' mission. Simon of Cyrene and Joseph of Arimathea were heirs to a tradition of exploration, survival, and preservation of knowledge. They didn't just lift across, they carried centuries of strategy, wisdom, and lineage that had crossed continents, oceans, and civilizations. That's why Europe feared them. That's why they had to erase them. Because once you start seeing Africa in the Americas before Columbus, the story you were told about the discovery of the world collapses. Suddenly, the lies aren't just inconvenient, they're absurd. And suddenly, the pride of rediscovery hits harder. The ancestors weren't missing. They weren't passive. They were there, always there, shaping the world while others claimed it for themselves. They tell you Europe invented the printing press, navigation tools, modern medicine, even martial arts. That's a lie. A polished, textbook-friendly lie designed to make the world forget who built the foundations. Africans created these innovations centuries before Europeans discovered them. And the men who walked with Jesus, they carried the same intellectual lineage. Knowledge wasn't accidental. It was inherited, preserved, and transmitted until Europe tried to steal it. Take paper. Long before Gutenberg, Africans were using papyrus and other early paper forms to record knowledge. Libraries in Timbuktu alone housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Math, astronomy, law, philosophy, medicine, preserved in a way Europe would only rediscover hundreds of years later. The printing press didn't invent knowledge. It copied knowledge that had been created, refined, and passed down in Africa for centuries. That's why African scholars were the invisible architects of literacy and learning across continents. Martial arts, that's right. Combat systems, self-defense techniques, even battlefield strategy in Europe were influenced by African methods. Warriors from the Sahel, Nubia, and Ethiopia trained in disciplines that combined agility, precision, and intelligence. These systems spread through trade, conquest, and migration. When Europeans finally wrote down their versions of fencing or military strategy, they were building on stolen African innovations. Ask yourself, How much of what we call European genius is actually African ingenuity, repackaged? Navigation. Africans mastered stars, currents, and rivers long before Columbus or Magellan. West African sailors crossed the Atlantic. North African traders mapped the Mediterranean and beyond. African knowledge of tides, winds, and celestial navigation made European exploration possible. Even if Europe got the credit, the men walking with Jesus weren't isolated from this intellectual network. They carried strategies, knowledge, and awareness that connected continents, making them capable of preserving sacred teachings while moving across dangerous lands. Medicine. African healers performed surgeries, developed antiseptics, and documented herbal treatments centuries before European discoveries. Their knowledge spread across continents, preserved in manuscripts, oral traditions, and the practices of disciples. When Europe later claimed credit for modern medicine, they were standing on African shoulders, and that's the pattern. Africa creates, Europe copies, Europe rewrites, Africa is erased. Even religion wasn't safe. Rituals, symbols, and philosophical systems that Africa developed influenced European theology, Christian symbolism, and spiritual practices. African priests, scribes, and disciples carried wisdom, ritual knowledge, and ethical frameworks that became the foundation for what Europe would later claim as its own spiritual authority. Every whitewashed altar, every repainted saint, every sanitized text erased the fingerprints of Africa's genius. Ask yourself, why would Europe go to such lengths to steal these innovations? Because power isn't just about armies or land. Power is about controlling knowledge. If you can erase the source, you can sell the result and make the world believe it originated with you. That's how centuries of theft happened, in plain sight, disguised as progress, and generations never knew they were inheriting stolen wisdom. Here's the emotional truth. The men who walked with Jesus, the African disciples, were carriers of this legacy. They didn't just lift a cross, they lifted the weight of centuries of African innovation, knowledge, and leadership, and the world owes its foundations to them. Quietly, invisibly, unfairly, and when Europe erased them from the story, they tried to erase the knowledge too. But the fingerprints survive, hidden in art, science, architecture, and oral traditions. Imagine realizing that every European invention you were taught was built on African genius, that the fire you thought was theirs was lit centuries before by your ancestors, that the men who carried Jesus weren't just witnesses, they were scholars, warriors, and preservers of a knowledge so powerful it terrified the world. That's why history had to lie, and that's why reclaiming it hits harder than anything you've been taught in school. You ever wonder why every Bible in your childhood looked the same? Pale Jesus, pale disciples, pale prophets. That's not a coincidence. That's deliberate. The Ethiopian Bible, one of the oldest in existence, tells a different story. Black prophets, African kings, even Jesus' closest followers, portrayed in ways that Europe didn't want you to see. And when you realize this, the manipulation hits you like a punch. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved texts and traditions that predate most Western Bibles, names, lineages, prophecies, and stories that clearly place Africans at the center of God's plan, erased elsewhere. From Moses' advisors to Ethiopian kings referenced in the Old Testament, the evidence is there. And the African disciples of Jesus were heirs to this spiritual lineage. Their faith wasn't imported, it was inherited. It was grounded in wisdom that Europe would later try to suppress. Joseph of Arimathea, Simon of Cyrene, and other disciples weren't just helpers, they were vessels of this spiritual intelligence, guardians of sacred knowledge, and carriers of African interpretation of divine truth. In the moment Europe started whitewashing images, rewriting stories, and repackaging scripture, they weren't just lying about color, they were stealing authority. They were erasing the idea that African people had been integral to God's plan since the beginning. Ask yourself, if your ancestors were at the center of spiritual history, then why were they systematically erased from every depiction, every sermon, every stained glass window? Because power in the world isn't just political, it's moral. If you can convince people that holiness, wisdom, and divine favor belong to someone else, you control the moral high ground. That's what centuries of whitewashing accomplished. And that's why rediscovering the Ethiopian Bible and other African spiritual texts feels like finding fire in a rainstorm. Shocking, illuminating, and essential. Even the apocryphal texts carry clues, stories of prophets, miracles, and wisdom traditions that never made it into the Western canon show an African presence in early spiritual thought. These weren't footnotes, they were foundation. And when the disciples carried Jesus' message across the Roman world, they carried this knowledge too. Methods of teaching, interpreting, and surviving persecution, all rooted in African spiritual traditions. The erasure was intentional, yes. But here's the twist. You don't have to dig centuries back to see it. Every time you see a whitewashed depiction of Jesus or his disciples, every time a textbook minimizes African influence, the pattern repeats. It's a psychological weapon that convinces you and the world that Africans weren't central to faith, civilization, or morality. And yet, the truth survives, quietly, stubbornly, waiting for someone to recognize it. Imagine the pride of realization. Your ancestors weren't passive, they weren't observers, they were prophets, carriers of divine knowledge, scholars, and protectors. Europe tried to steal their story, hide their images, rewrite the narrative. But when you uncover the Ethiopian Bible, when you trace lineages and symbols, you see the power that was never meant to be erased. And that power, it's yours to reclaim. Ask yourself, if Europe could erase spiritual authority, if they could manipulate images and stories to control perception of morality, then what else have they hidden? What other truths about your heritage, your knowledge, and your ancestors' role in shaping faith have been buried? And more importantly, what happens when you refuse to accept the lies anymore? Because once you start seeing the spiritual lineage, the African prophets, and the disciples' central role, everything changes. Faith isn't a foreign story imposed on your people. It's inherited, it's connected, it's alive. And the moment you recognize that, you begin to reclaim what was stolen: identity, pride, power, and history itself. They didn't just erase history, they erased identity. That's the cruel genius of erasure. Remove the names, the faces, the lineages, the innovations, and people begin to doubt themselves. Generation after generation, you grow up thinking your ancestors didn't matter, that your history is less than, that greatness was never yours to claim. That's psychological warfare, disguised as education. Think about it. When every Bible, every textbook, every museum, every classroom image says your ancestors were absent, invisible, or minor, your mind begins to internalize that. Doubt creeps in. Maybe they weren't important. Maybe we weren't important. And once doubt takes root, pride dies quietly, slowly, invisibly. That's what centuries of whitewashing did. That's what centuries of theft accomplished. They didn't just steal artifacts, they stole confidence. But the human mind is powerful. Even when stolen from, people retain memory in fragments. Oral traditions, music, rituals, and stories survive, often without conscious recognition. You see traces in African American spirituals, in Caribbean folklore, in family stories passed quietly from parent to child. The brain remembers what the textbooks tried to erase, and when those fragments resurface, it's electric. It jolts memory, pride, and consciousness awake. This erasure doesn't just affect culture, it affects perception, behavior, and potential. When you believe your ancestors didn't matter, you underestimate your own influence. You accept limits that never existed. You allow systems to dictate what you can and cannot achieve. And that's the brilliance of psychological control. It works even when you think you're free. It's invisible chains, passed down silently, woven into generations. Ask yourself, how deep does this go? Every time a civilization, a people, or a lineage is erased from history, the erasure compounds. Knowledge is lost, pride is suppressed, and identity is fractured. That's why understanding the truth isn't optional. Reclaiming memory isn't nostalgia, it's survival, it's empowerment, it's the antidote to centuries of systemic manipulation. Here's the wild part. The disciples who walked with Jesus, the Moors who preserved civilization, the African pharaohs and prophets, they understood this. They knew history could be weaponized. They knew knowledge could be stolen, and they acted by preserving manuscripts, passing down knowledge orally, and embedding wisdom in practices. They ensured that even under erasure, their influence survived. And here we are, centuries later, finding the breadcrumbs, piecing together the story, reconnecting with what was stolen. This is why history is more than dates, names, and events. It's identity, it's psychology. When people forget, they become vulnerable to manipulation. When people remember, they become unstoppable. And that's why erasure was so terrifying to those in power, because memory is power, pride is power, knowledge is power. Europe tried to take it. They lied, burned, repainted, and erased. But the truth can't be completely destroyed. It's in the stones, in the scrolls, in the rivers, in the bloodline of those who survived. Imagine the awakening. A generation realizes their ancestors were architects, warriors, scholars, prophets. The same people they were told were absent were actually the foundation of faith, civilization, and knowledge. That realization fractures doubt. It replaces it with pride, agency, and identity. It's electric, almost dangerous, because once people see the pattern, the lies unravel faster than any institution can react. And here's the question to carry you forward. If erasure can manipulate generations, what happens when those generations finally reclaim memory? When the lost histories are remembered, celebrated, and integrated into identity, the world doesn't just shift, it trembles, because power, true power, has always been tied to knowing who you are and where you come from. And now, the truth is coming back to you. They told you Africa was passive. They told you slavery and colonization wiped out entire cultures. That's cute. Africa doesn't disappear. Africa resists. Always has. Always will. Ethiopia, Benin, Mali, Haiti. These aren't just names in a history book. They're proof that when the world tried to erase you, some people refused to be erased. And that resistance carried into the Americas, into faith, into every part of the diaspora. Take Ethiopia, the only African nation that successfully resisted colonization for centuries. Men and women wielded strategy, knowledge, and sheer willpower to defend their sovereignty. They weren't isolated. They were connected to the legacy of pharaohs, prophets, and scholars. Their victories weren't just military. They were cultural, spiritual, and psychological. They said without saying a word, "We exist, we matter, and we will survive." Benin, a kingdom of art, wealth, and sophistication that Europe could not ignore. Bronze statues, architectural genius, trade networks spanning continents. When European traders and colonizers came, they saw a society built on intellect and strategy. And what did they do? They tried to steal it. They looted treasures, kidnapped artisans, burned records. But Benin survived, in memory, in lineage, in cultural practices that outlasted empires. That's resilience. That's refusing erasure. Mali, Timbuktu, the city of 400,000 manuscripts, libraries that preserved philosophy, science, and law, while Europe struggled through the Dark Ages. The Mansa Musa legacy wasn't just wealth, it was knowledge, it was power, it was pride. Europeans tried to destroy it, yet the manuscripts, oral traditions, and cultural memory survive. Ask yourself, if Africa could produce civilizations that Europe couldn't erase, what does that say about the narrative of inferiority we've been taught? Haiti, the first successful slave revolt, the first Black Republic, enslaved Africans brought knowledge, strategy, and resilience across the Atlantic. They were the descendants of kingdoms, of empires, of the men who carried Jesus, of those who preserved civilization. When they rose up, They shattered myths about black inferiority. They reminded the world that stolen people could reclaim freedom, identity, and sovereignty. And their story, still minimized in history books, still whitewashed, still underappreciated. Here's the pattern. Resistance isn't just military, it's cultural, it's spiritual, it's intellectual, it's refusing to let erasure define your identity. Every African empire, every rebellion, every preserved manuscript, every surviving tradition is a testament to refusal. And when you connect that to the disciples of Jesus, the Moors, the Pharaohs, and the prophets, you see continuity. Survival is coded into the bloodline, into the culture, into the knowledge passed down through generations. And here's the emotional weight. The world wants you to believe that oppression equals erasure, that stolen history equals forgotten history, that stolen innovation equals permanent loss. But resistance shows a different truth. Survival, memory, and pride can't be fully erased. The African lineage persists in your blood, in your culture, in your identity. And once you recognize that, the lies of the past lose power over the present. Ask yourself, if Africa could resist centuries of theft, colonization, and slavery, then what else is reclaimable? What else has survived beneath the surface of textbooks, films, and media? The proof isn't just in artifacts, it's in the people, the diaspora, the descendants who carry this legacy unknowingly. And once you see it, once you claim it, everything changes, because the story isn't just about survival, it's about thriving in spite of the erasure. It's about carrying knowledge, culture, and spiritual power across continents and generations. It's about realizing that no matter how much the world tried to hide your ancestors' brilliance, that brilliance never died. And now, centuries later, it's ready to be recognized. Look around. Open your phone, scroll your feed, turn on the news. The same pattern repeats. Africa erased, black excellence minimized, whitewashed narratives reinforced. The same tricks Europe used centuries ago, they're alive today, just upgraded. Control the image, control the mind. The old psychological weapon is now digital, pervasive, and insidious. Take movies, for example. Every blockbuster tells a story where black people are secondary, exotic, or villainized. History shows up only in footnotes, and when it does, it's distorted. The Moors, the disciples, African innovators, repackaged, misattributed, or erased entirely. It's not just entertainment, it's education by omission. Every time a child consumes this media, they absorb a version of reality that minimizes their heritage. And adults, many never question it. That's mental colonization at scale. Social media isn't innocent either. Algorithms favor what keeps attention and ad revenue flowing. That often means promoting narratives that uphold existing power structures, stories where black influence is marginal, where the African presence in history is negligible. Even content that celebrates black achievement is often framed as exceptional rather than foundational. Ask yourself, how much of your worldview has been subtly shaped without you realizing it? Education, meanwhile, is still a battlefield. Textbooks sanitize, footnote, and marginalize. Students learn about the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and early Christianity, but rarely the African scholars, the Moors, the disciples, the Pharaohs, the inventors who made it possible. Generations are raised in a system that celebrates the thieves and minimizes the builders. And the psychological impact, it's profound. Internalized doubt, lowered self-expectations, and acceptance of an incomplete narrative. Even politics and language play a role. The subtle erasure of African contributions in speeches, literature, and public ceremonies reinforces a worldview where whiteness is default and black influence is optional. Black history is celebrated in moments, not integrated as foundation. The mental chain isn't always visible, but it's strong, and it persists. That's the trick. Centuries of theft become normalized. Lies become invisible, and you start questioning your own history instead of theirs. But here's the awakening. Every erased history leaves breadcrumbs, the manuscripts, the mosaics, the artifacts, the oral traditions, the cultural echoes, they all survive. And now, with access to research, digital archives, and global networks, the erasure is being confronted. The stories of the Moors, the African disciples, the Pharaohs, the innovators, and the explorers are resurfacing, slowly, stubbornly, and powerfully. And when people start to see it, the mental chains start to snap. Ask yourself, if centuries of manipulation couldn't fully erase African influence, then what else are you capable of reclaiming today? Knowledge, culture, pride, and history aren't just historical curiosities. They are weapons of liberation. Once you understand the depth of your ancestors' power, the modern systems of erasure lose authority. And that's why education, media literacy, and historical reclamation are revolutionary acts. Here's the emotional truth. This isn't just about the past. It's about today, tomorrow, and the generations that follow. Every time you question a whitewashed story, every time you honor an African invention, every time you recognize the disciples, the Moors, or the Pharaohs, you're reclaiming mental space stolen from your ancestors. You're rewriting the narrative your children will inherit. That's power, that's freedom, that's pride. And here's the chilling part. Once you see the pattern, once you recognize the theft, you can't unsee it. Every news story, every film, every textbook suddenly becomes a battlefield of truth. You start noticing what's missing. And the more you notice, the more the system feels threatened. That's why reclaiming history isn't just nostalgia. It's a revolution of consciousness, a fight for the mind, as much as the body or the soul. They tried to steal your past, erase your achievements, and make you doubt your worth. But the blueprint survives, always has. The question is, are you ready to reclaim it? Because this isn't just history, it's inheritance, knowledge, culture, spirituality, and strategy that your ancestors preserved against every attempt to erase them, waiting for you to recognize it. Reclaiming the blueprint starts with awareness. It's about reading beyond the textbooks, listening beyond the mainstream narratives, investigating libraries, oral histories, and artifacts that survived centuries of deliberate destruction. When you start connecting the dots, the African disciples, the Moors who saved Europe, the Pharaohs, the innovators, the explorers, you see a network of brilliance that was never meant to be forgotten. And when you see it, pride isn't optional, it's automatic. It's also practical. African traditions, from medicine and agriculture to spiritual practices and governance, still hold wisdom for today. Learning from them isn't just honoring the past, it's improving the present. Yoga, herbal medicine, numeracy, architecture, navigation, and philosophy all have African roots that shaped civilizations globally. Reclaiming these truths equips you with tools your ancestors mastered centuries before Europe discovered them. And it's deeply emotional. When you trace your lineage, when you connect your present to your ancestors' survival, innovation, and resilience, you feel it in your body. Pride, fire, motivation. You realize you are the continuation of a chain that carried knowledge across oceans, preserved civilization, and resisted erasure. The men who carried Jesus, the Moors who rebuilt Europe, the kings of Mali and Benin, their DNA, their legacy, their lessons live in you. Ask yourself, what would change if you carried that awareness into every part of your life, into education, into work, into spirituality, into how you raise your children? Once you see yourself as part of that continuum, every challenge transforms. You're not just surviving, you're building on foundations laid by people who defied annihilation, colonization, and theft, people who refuse to be erased. Reclaiming the blueprint also means confronting false narratives. Question every story where your ancestors are minimized. Examine every depiction that erases Black influence. Analyze every system built on the illusion of African absence. And don't stop there. Create your own narratives, your own records, your own art, your own archives. Replace the lies with truth. Rewrite the story with your voice. That's reclamation. That's power. That's freedom. The beauty is, this reclamation isn't abstract. It's cultural, spiritual, and communal. Music, art, language, rituals, festivals, these are all ways to re-anchor yourself in heritage. Learning African languages, practicing African spiritual traditions, celebrating African ingenuity. These acts reconnect you to the blueprint. They remind the world, and yourself, that erasure was never total, that pride, knowledge, and resilience endure. And here's the emotional payoff. Once you start reclaiming the blueprint, doubt can no longer control you. The mental chains that centuries of erasure forged begin to break. Confidence rises, identity solidifies, purpose clarifies. You begin to see the world, not as a system designed to minimize you, but as a space where your ancestors' lessons, strength, and brilliance give you advantage. Ask yourself, if your ancestors could preserve knowledge under slavery, colonization, and genocide, then what can you preserve in your lifetime? What truths can you uncover, amplify, and pass down? Reclaiming the blueprint isn't optional. It's a responsibility. And the moment you accept it, the stories of Africa, the disciples, the Moors, the Pharaohs, and every erased genius come alive through you. Because history doesn't only belong in textbooks or museums, it belongs in you. And when you reclaim it, you don't just honor the past, you shape the future. Imagine a world where nobody forgot. Imagine walking into a classroom and seeing African pharaohs, Moors, and disciples celebrated as the architects of civilization. Imagine textbooks that don't footnote your ancestors, but place them at the center of every achievement, every discovery, every innovation. Imagine a world where pride isn't optional. It's automatic, undeniable, and universal. What would that feel like? Every black child growing up, seeing heroes that look like them, scholars that look like them, saints, scientists, and explorers that carry their lineage. No more erasure, no more lies. Every monument, every film, every museum would acknowledge the truth. Africa built the foundation. Africans preserved knowledge. Africans carried the wisdom that shaped the world. That's a revolution of consciousness, not violence, though the impact would be seismic. Imagine the disciples walking with Jesus, no longer whitewashed, no longer erased. Simon of Cyrene, Joseph of Arimathea, their faces, their lineage, their courage recognized. Every Easter, every church service, every sacred text would reflect truth, not a fabricated image designed to serve power. The spiritual weight of that recognition would be electric. Faith wouldn't feel borrowed or imposed. It would feel inherited, alive, connected, powerful. And imagine modern life through that lens. African innovations credited, African culture celebrated, African philosophy taught as foundational. Every STEM classroom, every art gallery, every historical lecture acknowledging that the blueprint came from the very people they once tried to erase. Society would understand the true origin of wealth, knowledge, and power. Respect wouldn't be optional. Pride wouldn't be optional. Identity wouldn't be optional. But it's not just about recognition. It's about what happens to a people when they stop doubting themselves. When they fully remember, fully see, fully acknowledge who they are. Generations rise differently. Choices change. Communities thrive. Confidence spreads like wildfire. Systems built on doubt and erasure start to crumble because they can't survive against a people who fully know their worth. Ask yourself, what would you do if your ancestors' brilliance was fully visible, fully recognized, fully celebrated? How would it change the way you see your work, your relationships, your purpose? How would it reshape the way society values knowledge, creativity, and morality? When the truth is fully seen, every lie begins to collapse, and what was once stolen becomes unstoppable. Imagine the Moors, the African navigators, the scholars, the disciples, the pharaohs, the prophets, all visible, all honored, the theft of centuries laid bare. And in that clarity, empowerment becomes inevitable. History isn't a chain that binds you anymore. It's a foundation you can build on. Pride becomes instinctual, vision becomes limitless, and the mental chains of doubt and internalized inferiority, gone, burned away by the light of truth. And here's the deepest truth. A world that never forgot wouldn't just change for black people, it would change for everyone. Understanding the origin of knowledge, the contribution of civilizations, the truth of spiritual and intellectual history, would reframe education, politics, and culture. Respect for truth would replace manufactured narratives. Systems built on theft and lies would lose their legitimacy. Imagine the world if the blueprint of Africa was universally acknowledged. But the question lingers, why did we forget? And more importantly, what will we do now that we remember? Forgetting was a choice forced upon us. Reclaiming is a choice we make. Every name remembered, every innovation credited, every story told rewrites the world. The past becomes power, and power, when fully understood, can change the course of everything. Here's the truth. Nobody ever taught you. You are the continuation of a story that was never meant to survive. Every innovation, every sacrifice, every act of resistance your ancestors performed, it flows in your veins. The men who carried Jesus' cross, the African disciples who preserved his teachings, the Moors who rebuilt Europe, the kings, the scholars, the prophets, their legacy is alive in you. In the moment you recognize that, the world itself feels different. They lied, they erased, they repackaged your ancestors' brilliance as someone else's, but you are seeing it, you are feeling it. Every stolen crown, every whitewashed image, every manipulated textbook, powerless against the awakening of a people who remember. And when memory awakens, pride ignites, and identity becomes undeniable. The world can no longer hide from the truth. The power of this awakening isn't abstract, it's practical, spiritual, and visceral. Knowledge, strategy, art, faith, science, all of it carries forward. Your work, your creativity, your relationships, your communities, all are extensions of what your ancestors built, preserved, and protected. You inherit not just DNA, but wisdom, resilience, and ingenuity. That inheritance is wealth beyond money. It's sovereignty beyond borders. It's freedom beyond chains. Ask yourself, if the men who walked with Jesus could carry wisdom across centuries, survive empires, preserve faith, and resist erasure, then what stops you from doing the same in your life today? The blueprint exists. It's been in your hands, in your mind, in your spirit, waiting for recognition. And now that you see it, nothing can take it from you. This is more than history. This is truth-telling. This is reclamation, and it's deeply personal, because the awakening doesn't just change your understanding of the past, it changes your understanding of yourself. Every doubt planted by centuries of lies begins to crumble. Every limitation imposed by stolen narratives loses its grip. Every story that told you you weren't enough is exposed as a lie, and in its place, pride, confidence, power, identity. Imagine the world when more people remember, when textbooks, media, and institutions can no longer hide the truth, when African excellence is recognized in every corner of global history, when the men who carried Jesus' teachings are honored alongside pharaohs, scholars, explorers, and innovators. That world is possible, it's waiting, and it starts with one person, one family, one community choosing to see the truth. The final awakening is both spiritual and practical. It's feeling the weight of centuries lift as you reclaim what belongs to you. It's seeing the stolen knowledge, innovations, and culture reflected in your daily life. It's recognizing that your ancestors' survival and brilliance is not just history, it's instruction, guidance, and power for your life today. Every choice you make, every truth you honor, every narrative you reclaim is a continuation of their work. So here's the final challenge. Carry the story forward, share it, teach it, live it, build on the foundations your ancestors laid, innovate, create, lead, Because erasure ends when memory becomes action, when pride becomes identity, when power becomes inherited, recognized and wielded. The men who carried Jesus' message across lands, the Moors who preserved civilization, the African kings, prophets, and scholars, they did not do it for themselves. They did it for the generations who would remember. And now, you are that generation. The time to awaken is not tomorrow, it's now. The chains of history have been broken by recognition. The knowledge is yours. The pride is yours. The blueprint is yours. And when you step into it fully, nothing can stop the truth from changing the world. Because once you awaken, you understand this. You are not lost. You were never absent. You were always here, always powerful, always brilliant. And now, finally, the story is yours to tell.